Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's episode of Totally Real Podcast. Strap in your seatbelts, because today we're driving head-on into a bus. That bus being, of course, sex. You heard that right. Today's topic of discussion is sex, and more specifically, why we don't talk about it. I think a good place to start this discussion is in the first place most people actually do talk about sex, and that is 5th grade sex ed. So, at least in my school, we called sex ed Growing and Changing, which right off the bat is kind of just a weird name. I remember it being in a really awkward setting. There was one teacher, a big dark room with every student in the entire school, and one whiteboard. And we just sat there, and it was really boring and uncomfortable. And I just think that the way Americans do sex ed in general is really poor and could be improved. And I think that it's possible, at least, that such an odd exposure to the topic of sex that Americans get in 5th grade could partially lead to how uninformed the general public is about sex and how odd we feel discussing it in daily life. Now, of course, we have to mention that in some settings, some contexts, people don't actually feel that uncomfortable discussing sexuality and sex in general. And some of those exceptions include close friendships, and also sex appears in various types of art, movies, comedy. But I don't think that these exceptions justify coming to a conclusion that Americans actually are comfortable discussing sex. I just think that these are some exceptions. And if you think about it, take, comedy movies, for example, a lot of the jokes that they make have to do with sex. And if Americans were in general fully comfortable with the topic of sex, I don't think that those jokes would even be considered funny. And the same kind of thing can be seen in other examples such as like art and paintings. It's been said that artists such as Caravaggio actually use sex to provoke and discomfort and captivate the viewer in a certain way. So I think it's fair to say that if sex didn't have such an impact on us that it does, and actually made us feel the way we do when it's discussed and when it's brought up, then it wouldn't have the appeal that it has when used in art and in comedy and in movies and so on. So now that I've kind of discussed this counter argument that could be presented that, well, we actually do talk about sex, I think it's kind of fair to leave the question standing and kind of get into this a little more. So without any further ado, why don't we talk about sex? So when I first started thinking about this, I kind of came up with 3 causes that I feel are most likely to have had an effect on us. So A, are humans just biologically and psychologically programmed to feel discomfort about the topic of sex? B, could the separation of the social classes and specifically the development of the middle class morality that appeared have had an impact? And C, could it possibly have been caused by the development and spread of various religions throughout history? So I guess I'll start off by discussing the biological and psychological aspect of this question. So just a general idea, is it biologically programmed into humans to feel discomfort about this topic? If we look to the work of Sigmund Freud, he personally believed that the socially imposed sexual repression is the major psychological problem facing mankind. The key word there is socially imposed, which suggests that it actually would not have been built into us to feel this way. It's actually a social thing. The problem, however, with going off of that is that pretty much every single one of Sigmund Freud's ideas that he ever came up with has been massively discredited by modern psychologists and modern psychology. But luckily, there is a slightly different field we can turn to, and that is evolutionary psychology. Specifically, looking at the work of Russell Eisenman, we find that humans actually make certain decisions based on a biological desire to reproduce, some of which we don't even realize we're doing as we're doing them. Some fascinating examples of this include the fact that there is actually a correlation between the provocativeness of a woman's attire and her position along her menstrual cycle. It has also been shown that humans prefer the smell of others to be maximally dissimilar to their own based on their MHC genes or major histocompatibility complex genes. And interestingly enough, these same genes have also been attributed to our attraction to symmetrical faces, which has actually been shown to develop instinctually in babies at an age far preceding the capacity for socialization. So if we're following his work in evolutionary psychology, it actually would suggest that we are not designed to cower from the thought of sex, but instead we tend to pursue the idea. So our fear of sexual openness must have been something social, like Sigmund Freud had said. So there we get the question, where did that come from? How did our society create this seemingly universal fear of open sexuality? This leads us to my next hypothesis, the division of the social classes. So we kind of get this middle class and lower class versus upper class kind of thing developing, and how does this potentially impact the feelings that different people feel in America towards sexuality? So on one hand, we tend to look at the wealthy as role models. At least they tend to have a large influence over society. So maybe this would lead them to hold on to tighter morals in an attempt to be a positive role model on our society. Or on the other hand, it's been said that wealthy people tend to equate money with freedom, so perhaps they'll tend to act less morally. Or perhaps there's no connection at all between social class and perception of sex. Let's find out. So if we just take a brief look into the past, it seems as if the wealthy people are historically famous for being less ethical, at least when it comes to sex and sexuality. And this can be observed just looking at all of the royalty throughout history who have been known to have affairs with their spouse. Even as far as 2,000 years ago, we have examples of this. There's Caligula, the Emperor of Rome. We have pretty much any Henry you could ask who happened to be royalty. We have Louis XIII, who was the King of France, Edward VII, King of the United Kingdom, Mary of Romania, Queen of, you guessed it, Romania, her being the most recent example on this list. My point of this is that it seems, just from at least this perspective, that those with wealth may not actually be inclined to act more morally because of their position as a role model for society. Now, of course, one could argue that this same kind of cheating could be going on in all positions along the social class spectrum, the wealth spectrum. But modern studies have actually helped to show that relative to lower class individuals, those from upper class backgrounds tend to behave more unethically in both naturalistic and laboratory settings. So where does this separation come from? As I had mentioned earlier, there's this thing called the middle class morality that began to develop, where we basically have individuals in the middle and lower classes seeking to act, I guess, better than those in the upper classes. And there was an interesting blog post on this. It's called On Middle Class Morality, and it gave one thought about why this happened. And it kind of talked about how in the middle and lower classes, in order to compensate for the monetary inferiority that they had to the wealthy nobility, they actually began to more tightly embrace their religious teachings. And at least according to this blog post, they kind of came up with the thought process of, I don't need all the money he needs because I'm going to heaven because I'm good. So maybe this is accurate, maybe it's not. I don't really know. I just thought it was an interesting take, an interesting discussion on why maybe those in the upper class may tend to be less morally inclined to behave well than those in lower classes and middle classes, those with less wealth. But regardless, there absolutely seems to be a correlation between one's social class and their moral standards and the moral standards that they hold themselves to. So it's definitely plausible that the existence of separate social classes has led to the discomfort we feel today in the presence of sexual discussion, because of that middle-class morality that developed. However, if this is true, then there is definitely a missing hole in the information. Here's what I mean. If the middle-class morality, which developed based on religion, is a cause, then that means religion is in fact a factor, and perhaps even a greater factor than the social classes themselves. Because according to the theory that I just talked about, the middle-class morality is based on the religion that those people held. And this actually transitions me perfectly into the next topic, which is what impact has religion had on our views regarding sex. Alright, so before we jump straight into has religion made us feel uncomfortable about sex, let's first just talk about how has religion influenced our perception of sex? I think a good place to start is by talking about premarital and extramarital sexual relations and how religion seems to have influenced that aspect. So right off the bat, there appears to be a correlation between one's religion and that person's likelihood of engaging in sexual relations outside of marriage. And this is just one example, but it does encourage the idea that religion does influence how we view sex. But there's actually another interesting factor at play here. According to Amy Adamski and Brittany Hayes, although various religions' sacred texts prescribe some of the same behaviors, religious institutions are not equally effective in shaping individuals' actions. A good example of this can be seen when looking at two separate religions, Christianity and Hinduism. With Christianity, it is strictly stated that, quote, fornicators will not inherit the kingdom of God. On the other hand, in Hinduism, kama, the fulfillment of sensual desires, is not only not considered immoral, but it is considered one of the necessities for a happy, successful life. That said, sex outside of marriage is still discouraged, but is not strictly prohibited. This in mind, one might assume that Hindus would be slightly more open to the idea of premarital sex than would Christians. However, the opposite seems to be true. According to one survey, Hindus are actually less likely than Christians to report having premarital sex. This goes to show that it's not necessarily the teachings to which one ascribes, but how those teachings are prevalent in their life, hence the institution being more impactful than the religion itself. This effect can actually be observed especially when looking at Muslim cultures. In their paper, Hayes and Adamski talked about how, for Muslims, religious participation and informal social interaction with other Muslims should increase exposure to religiously inspired norms that discourage premarital sex, limiting young people's interest in having sex before marriage. And then they went on to talk about how this effect is further amplified by strong bonds which young people may feel with their Muslim parents and friends, as violating their religious teachings might damage those close relationships. So all this is great, but we run into another issue. From what we've talked about thus far, it seems plausible that most of the discomfort we feel towards open sexuality seems to come from religion in some way. But what we just said is that it's not necessarily the religion itself that causes this, but the institution of it. Yet, according to the Pew Research Center, less than 40% of Americans attend church on a weekly basis. So how is it that we observe a near universal impact when it comes to this discomfort regarding open sexuality? Well, to answer that, I think we need to look a little more into the past. It's true that today, less than 40% of Americans attend church, but that wasn't always the case. See, back in ye days of old, the church actually had tremendous power over much of the early European lives, and strictly enforced the doctrines of Christianity and Catholicism. And we can see examples of this in events like Martin Luther being excommunicated for opposing traditional Catholic doctrines, and also in the early scientists like Galileo Galilei, who was given house arrest for life after just writing about heliocentric theory. In the world we live in today, the institution of religion in our lives doesn't seem to have much impact over most Americans. But look back to the lives of our ancestors, and the story is a little bit different. So I don't think it's unfair to say that maybe because of the influence that religion had over the lives of our ancestors, perhaps their lives and their society was altered to match these religious doctrines, just as Muslim societies are today. And I definitely think that that could have carried over to our own society in modern times, and might even be a major contributor to the fact that you feel so uncomfortable watching a sex scene in a movie with your grandparents sitting right next to you. What I'm saying is it's likely that the values and the morals and the traditions of those who came before us, who were so heavily impacted by religion in their lives, just carried through. Even though today not a lot of people seem to be heavily influenced by religion. So here I feel at least somewhat comfortable drawing something of a conclusion and saying that the power and spread of religion and religious teachings seem to be a major cause of our seemingly instinctual discomfort toward an openness regarding human sexuality, and with that, a discomfort towards talking about it. And yes, the emerging middle class definitely influenced our society's perception towards sex, but that was most likely because of their devotion to their religious values. So regardless of which way you go, I do think it's fair to say that religion is the major cause. And so there we have it. Why don't we talk about sex? Because of the heavy influence that religion once had over the society of our ancestors. So, having come up with a seemingly reasonable answer to that question, I now have a follow-up question. And that is, has this perception of sex and of sexuality that developed been a betterment or a detriment to our society? Or has it really had no impact? I mean, clearly we've managed to exist with these social preconceptions regarding sexuality, but would we be better off without them? In one sense, it seems as if they do in fact provide a benefit to our lives. For instance, they may help to prevent various physical consequences like unwanted pregnancy and sexually transmitted diseases. Like herpes. But does feeling bad about sex protect us better than open discussion might? The answer? It really depends. And here's what I mean by that. If we look back to Muslim culture, they have been very successful in regulating sexuality in a way that does grant their citizens these benefits. On the other hand, some cultures have found immense success in promoting more open sexuality within their society. But it seems as if the most successful societies in protecting from the potential consequences of sex are those who strive for one side or the other, control or openness and freedom. The U.S., unfortunately, seems to stick itself right in the middle, meaning we don't strictly enforce closed sexuality, but at the same time, we are very cut off to the idea of being open about it. So the question becomes, to which side should we try to lean? And I'm sure this could become a very complicated topic in itself, but here's my 2 cents. Considering we are sort of built on the idea of freedom, I personally don't think that the control method would sit very well with our people. Thus, I believe we should try to lean towards the openness side, and here's why I think this might work. Now, I'm going to reference the Dutch here because they do such a good job of this. In the Netherlands, sex education is much more comprehensive than it is here. For example, they recognize that an abstinence-only education doesn't just not work, but it fails horrendously, and it's been proven to do so. On the other hand, they embrace the idea that human sexuality is a perfectly natural part of life, and that the more resources with which children are equipped, the better off they will be. And they actually start sex education at just 4 years old. And at this age is when they try to teach kids about the importance of meaningful and respectful relationships that can promote good sexual health. They also have legalized prostitution as well as nude and topless beaches. Now, I recognize how controversial some of these things can be in America, and this seems pretty scary, right? But their method works, and ours just doesn't. For example, abortion in the United States is nearly twice as common as in the Netherlands. Teen pregnancy is almost 8 times more common in the US than in the Netherlands, and adults living with HIV or AIDS are roughly 3 times more common in the United States than they are in the Netherlands. I contend that if we want a better society and a better sexual culture, then we need to make a change. And I think that the Netherlands could be a good model for us to follow, at the very least in their sex ed program. I mean, the things that our media complains about are much less abundant there, and the stats speak for themselves. So with that, I'll leave you. Now you know why it's so awkward watching a sex scene in that one movie when your grandparents are sitting right next to you. Maybe someday it won't feel that way. This has been a Totally Real podcast. My name's Josh Muller. I hope you have a fantastic day, and thank you so much for listening.